My name is Stephen Short. I'm the president of the Albany Law School Black Law Students Association for the 2011-2012 academic year. Obviously, today is a huge day for us at BLSA and a huge day for us at Albany Law. We're welcoming one of the preeminent civil rights leaders of our time here to campus, so we're very excited about that. Before I introduce Mr. Jealous, I just want to give a few preliminary thank yous to some contributors here today. First of all, Dean Mayer, for your generous support, I'd like to thank you. Also, Persia Wilkins in the Diversity Office, Tanika Frost and Musa of the Capital District Black and Hispanic Bar Association, and Albany Law School's Communications Office all helped put this together, so I appreciate all the help. Benjamin Todd Jealous is the 17th President and Chief Executive Officer of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and the youngest person to hold the position in the organization's 103-year history. A Rhodes Scholar, a graduate of Columbia University, Mr. Jealous has also served as the President of the Rosenberg Foundation, Director of the United States Human Rights Program at Amnesty International, and Executive Director of the National Newspaper Publishers Association. As a student at Columbia, Mr. Jealous worked as a community organizer for the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund. On campus, Mr. Jealous led school-wide movements including boycotts and pickets for homeless rights, a successful campaign to save full-need financial aid, and an environmental justice battle with the university. Currently, in addition to his duties with the NAACP, Mr. Jealous is a board member of the California Council for Humanities and the Association of Black Foundation Executives, as well as the Asia Society. He's married to Lisa Epperson Jealous, a professor of constitutional law at American University's Washington College of Law, and a former civil rights litigator with the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund. They reside in Washington, D.C. with their young daughter. Today, Mr. Jealous will offer words on the shooting of Trayvon Martin and the state of our community, as well as what we can do to alleviate the blight of racism, which too often stains our lives as Americans. Following Mr. Jealous's keynote, a panel of distinguished voices will discuss racial profiling, both as a legal topic and a community issue. So with no further ado, I'd like to welcome Mr. Benjamin Todd Jealous, President of the NAACP.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here. Thank you, Dean Mayer. Thank you to the members of the Albany branch of the NAACP who are here. Thank you to the Black Law Students Association. To Mr. Short, he is short. I am jealous. And I also would like to thank my cousin Damon Lipscomb, who's a 3L here, and encouraged me to come up before he graduated. Damon's like a baby brother to me, and we were reminiscing today about the way in which sort of old, powerful symbols, even of racism, don't have to always hold their power. When I was 10 years old and Damon was 5, my great uncle, his grandfather, woke me up one day with a pullout from the newspaper for a sale at JCPenney, a Diamond Mall in West Baltimore, and he pointed to this picture, which, as I was opening my eyes, all I could see was a Confederate battle flag, but it was actually a Dukes of Hazzard bedspread. And he said, Damon would love this. Get out of bed, we'll surprise him. And to look in the eyes of that black man born and raised in deep southern Virginia, who had as much of an aversion to the Confederate flag as my grandfather or even myself, and see that he could so overlook all of that history and pain because his grandson, who was 5 years old and loved the Dukes of Hazzard and didn't really understand all the symbology of the TV show, wanted that bedspread. Freaked me out at the moment. I was like, really? Really? You want me to get out of bed to go buy a Confederate flag bedspread? But years later, to me, is a testament both to the love of a grandfather and the possibility for even our most powerful divisive symbols to change their meaning over time through the eyes of our young people. I want to talk today about racial profiling. Happy to take questions about the Trayvon Martin case. We're actually in a moment of questions right now because there's just been an announcement that they expect him to be charged late this afternoon, early this evening, unconfirmed. There's been a lot of talk about stand your ground laws. I'm happy to take questions about that. Mayor Bloomberg's with some of my staff in DC right now pushing on an effort to repeal stand your ground laws. But at the heart of this case, when you listen to people in Sanford, I spent a week there on the ground recently and held hearings in the community. This case strikes a chord for two reasons in that community. One, because of widespread pain and frustration with racial profiling. And two, because of much more deeply felt, narrowly felt pain that the homicides, the killing of black men, is just not treated the same way by the local law enforcement community as the killing of other people. And thus it's possible for a young man to be shot dead 70 feet from his father's girlfriend's house and the police don't knock on any doors to say, who is this young man? It's possible for a young man to be shot dead and have a cell phone in his pocket, and for 3 days no one hits the call button to find out who he was talking to 10 minutes before and therefore who he was. And what connects these two things is a sense that black men and boys are simply viewed differently in our society. And there is, of course, if you look at the history of segregation in our society, rich evidence that that has been the case for a very, very long time. The issue of racial profiling is an important issue because it divides our society, literally prevents our society from realizing the prayer that our children say in school every day. I know we tend to believe that there is not prayer in school. But if you haven't listened to the Pledge of Allegiance that our children say every day, recently I encourage you to listen to it. Because in this country, which has been so deeply divided for so long, to describe us as one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all, is a prayer. It is what we hope to be. It is what we aspire to be. It is what we are as an idea. And our nation is first and foremost an idea. But it is not the lived experience of millions of people in this country. And it should be. And our children, when they're young, like my daughter is in kindergarten, say that every day, they believe that's what it is, and we owe it to them to finally make our nation that. When we say on the back of our money, e pluribus unum, out of many one, that is a prayer. That is what we aspire to be, but is not what we are yet. And this official license of treating people differently, more suspicious because of something they cannot change, their color, their hair texture, the faith of their ancestors, is a wedge in our society that we have to deal with decisively. We're sitting there in Sanford, listening to mothers crying about their sons being killed by bad cops, by thugs. Didn't matter, same pain, because in each case, wasn't dealt with, wasn't solved. And then alternately in these testimonies, listening to men get up and talk about being humiliated in front of the Walmart, 55-year-old man, well-dressed, as he always apparently is, walking down the street, and the cops decide he's suspicious. 3 cops stop him, a white cop, a Latino cop, and a black cop. The only thing different about what the black cop has to say is the black cop says, don't worry about it, brother. The same thing happens to me when I'm out of uniform. That just enraged him more. New York City, Bloomberg's a big ally of ours on Stand Your Ground. He's also the biggest proponent of racial profiling in this country right now. His stop and frisk program has roughly one stop and frisk, searching for drugs, one stop and frisk of a set of people between 18 and 35 for every black man there is between 18 and 35 in the city. There's about 280,000 stop and frisks, primarily a young black man between 18 and 35, and there's about 300,000 young black men between 18 and 35 in the city. It's supposed to make us safer. But as I will discuss, when you focus on what people look like rather than what people do, you undermine the purposes of law enforcement and you make us less safe as a society. Increasingly in our country, we are dealing with very powerful, well-funded networks of criminals. When you maintain a war on drugs for decades and you don't tax drug sales, what happens over time? The networks get richer and richer. When you are fighting terrorists like Osama bin Laden and his network, you trace back, Osama bin Laden's a very wealthy man, connected to a lot of very wealthy people. And that means that ultimately the agents of any crime don't necessarily have to look like even the dominant group involved, because they can afford to get whoever they want to run whatever they want whenever they want to. And so there's an effect in racial profiling known as the carnival effect. You flood the gates, you flood the turnstile, and the ones who get through are the ones you send back. If the black guy is suspicious and is pulled away again and again, then you don't send the black folks through. You send somebody else who looks differently through. So how does this play out? I want to tell you stories of 4 cases. The first is the DC snipers. Raise your hand if you remember the DC sniper case 10 years ago. All right. Raise your hand if you're from Washington, D.C. or the environs. All right, so you got one in the back, one over there. Raise a hand if you were afraid to pump gas that week. Keep your hand still up, right? All right. It was an insane situation. There were snipers who were shooting people in the head, often while they pumped gas or walked into big box stores around the perimeter of the Washington, D.C. Beltway. Those of us who lived in the city, within the Beltway or near to it, were told literally to bob and weave as we pumped our gas. Keep our head moving at all times so they couldn't get a beat on it. The killers evaded the police for days, which became more than a week. The comedian Dave Chappelle noted that the killer was taken off the weekends. And Dave, and this is his off-color comment, so don't cut the videotape and ascribe it to me. Dave said, when all of this is done, and he took note of the profile. The profile in the newspaper had about 10 characteristics. The killers were most likely military trained. The killers were most likely traveling alone in small groups. And on and on and on. And at the end of it, it said the killer was probably male and probably white. Because the racial profile for a lone gunman assassin in our country is a white male. Now that gets into a deeper history that goes back, ties into the history of serial killers and the fact that serial killers in the black community have not typically been picked up on because we tend to devalue deaths that happen in the black community and not spend as much time piecing the pieces together. So there's a whole part of sociology there that I could go into. But the bottom line is that we had a whole bunch of behavioral characteristics and then a couple of sort of suggestions about what the race might be, what the gender might be. And the police threw up blinders. First thing that happened, there were dragnets around, I'll come back to Dave Chappelle in a second. There were dragnets around the Beltway that would go up in an instant whenever somebody was shot. And they would only focus on the white men going through the dragnets. And they wouldn't focus on anybody else. Then the car became racially profiled. It wasn't just a white man we were looking for a white man in a white van. They rhymed. And I could stand there in my offices on Pennsylvania Avenue at Amnesty International on the 6th floor overlooking Penn Ave Southeast and watch anybody in a white van get jacked up by the cops. Man, Capitol Police would swarm on them. 12 Latino day laborers in a white van, they were on it. And on the Beltway, that borderline between the suburbs and the city, the same thing was happening to any white man driving when every one of those dragnets went up. The police were fixated on these racial identifier and gender identifier at the end of the list. Dave Chappelle was looking at behavior. Dave Chappelle says, when this is all done, they're going to figure out that the killer was a black man. Why, he asked himself? Because they're taking off the weekends. When I said white psychopaths, they don't take off the weekends. So they do some of their best work. Black psychopaths, maybe we take off the weekends. As off color as his humor was, he was focusing on behavior. The cops were fixated on race. The killings continued. We continued to bob and weave as we pumped our gas. And in the end, they arrest a black man and a black boy. A black man wearing a military jacket. A black man traveling either alone when the boy was in the trunk with the gun, or in a small group when the boy sat by his side. One of the other behavioral characteristics was antisocial. Black man who most days smelled bad because he didn't bathe most days. We know that now from the records of where he did bathe at the YMCA I go to with my family each day. And smelling bad is a sign of being antisocial. A black man who was stopped 9 times by the police before they looked in the trunk and found the gun. If they had taken a dog that was trained to sniff for firearms, within 10 feet of that car, I predict to you that the dog would have howled at the moon because they were shooting out of the trunk of the car. But the racial profile had 8 behavioral characteristics. This man met all of them. And then it had a couple of racial suggestions. And well, that's the way that racial profiling works. As soon as you insert race into the equation, as soon as you insert gender into the equation, the blinders go up, common sense stops. Dave Chappelle might be able to solve the crime before you can. This happened to be going on while I was writing a report for Amnesty International about racial profiling post 9/11. While we were working on that report, watching all this unfold in front of our eyes, something else was happening. There was a white student at the University of Maryland who was hopping on flights on Southwest Airlines. And one day he had a box cutter in his bag, and he noticed it went right through security. So the next time he put a couple of knives in his bag, and it went right through security, right through the x-ray. So eventually he'd done that so many times that he started hiding the knives on the plane that he would fly on frequently, like in the bathroom vanity, taping it there. And he'd get on the plane a couple weeks later, going back home, and it was still there. And so then he said, well, what do the police use to run through these machines that look like explosives? What inert product that looks like explosives I put in my bag that if they're trained to look for explosives, they would say, oh my God, that might be an explosive. So he got some of that and he put that in his bag with the knives. And it went right through security. And then he would hide some of that in the bathroom vanity. And it would still be there in a couple of weeks. So at this point, he's just getting frustrated, right? I mean, clearly this guy wants some attention. Anybody who goes through security with a bunch of knives and some that looks like C4 explosive wants attention, right? Because you're going to get it if they notice. And he says, you know what? I'm just going to leave some Post-it notes. Not in the vanity because they ain't looking there. Not on my bag because they ain't looking on that. No, I'll leave them on my seat and I'll leave them, you know what? I'll even leave my bag in the overhead with a note on the outside. And then they arrest him. Now, meanwhile, I'm traveling all over the country for Amnesty International, light-skinned black dude, getting stopped and frisked every time I go through the airport. Think my middle name is random. They tell me they're checking me randomly. Or maybe it's because I look vaguely Arab. I don't know. But this cat's going to the same airport, BWI, with things that look like explosives and things that actually are knives, and they're not stopping him at all. At all. That's how the carnival effect works. You send Ben Jealous to the turnstile after 9/11, it doesn't matter that my family came over to Salem in 1636. Or I'm Dick Cheney's cousin since 1701. Or that the slave side of my family came over thereabouts to Virginia and we've been here and built this country as much as anybody else. Or that my eyes apparently come from the Native American side of the family that goes back to Korea sometime across some Bering Strait bridge. You know that from genetics now. No, what matters is that the dude who's standing there who's not noticing the knives and the C4 explosive thinks I look suspicious. So the question is, what can we do about it? Well, you notice in that story about the DC sniper, they got fixated on race and they also got fixated on gender. Probably white, probably male. When it comes to presidential assassins, we used to fixate on gender too. And then Squeaky Fromm took a shot at Gerald Ford. And the next day, what happened? Secret Service said, you know what? You better check the women too. And whose life did that save? George H.W. Bush. Bush won, had a rally, a woman showed up with a pistol in her pocketbook. But for Squeaky Fromm, they wouldn't have been checking pocketbooks, and she would have taken a shot at the president, and she may have killed him. So maybe we need a racial Squeaky Fromm to end racial profiling. Well, it turns out we got one in 1901 here in New York State when President McKinley was assassinated. And a guy named Teddy Roosevelt got his big shot. He was his vice president. That's how he became president. Sitting president was assassinated. The ethnic profile at the time, racial ethnic profile at the time, of a presidential assassin was an Eastern European anarchist. And that translated into the fact you were looking for somebody who was swarthy, tall, with exotic facial hair. You see, the Russian premier had been killed years earlier, and the Eastern European anarchists had put out a warning to the leaders of the West. Be careful, we're coming for you next. I used to do presidential advance for President Clinton, and the way things work now are very similar to how they worked then. Technology's changed, a few things changed. Secret Service who are with us, they check pocketbooks now. But a lot hasn't changed. And so that day, the instruction at that fair was some sort of international fair. I forget whether it was a Pan American Expo or a World's Fair, but it was an international fair in New York State. The instruction to the Secret Service agent in charge of the rope line, which is the area you kind of enter into, it still works this way, it's cordoned off away from the main crowd where you can actually touch the president, was very similar to what it is today. You check every single person going into the rope line. You check them from head to toe because they're going to be within killing distance of the president. And the gunman walked in with the pistol in his hand, wrapped in a fake bandage. And they didn't touch his bandage. And he walked right up to President McKinley, and he shot him twice in the stomach before somebody in the crowd tackled him, and the bullet glanced off to the side. And the Secret Service agent in charge of the fair came running over to the rope line and said, "What happened?" And the guy in charge of the rope line said, "Well, he just looked like any other mechanic out for a day at the fair." Carnival theory again. They were looking for the guy with the exotic facial hair, who was swarthy and tall. He said, "You looked like any other mechanic out for a day at the fair, and it looked like he had a bum arm, and we didn't want to hurt his arm too much, but we think that he had a decoy, because right behind him, there was a swarthy man who was about 6'4", with a long mustache. And we focused our energy on him, boss, because we were told, boss, that was what we were looking for." He said, "Well, we better find the decoy then." So they found out. They fanned out, and they found the swarthy guy who was tall. And they came back and said, "We got good news, we got bad news." Well, what's the good news? The good news is we found your swarthy guy who's 6'4" with long, exotic facial hair. I said, "Well, what's the bad news then?" The bad news is he's the light-skinned black former Georgia constable who tackled the assailant before you guys could get there. We don't even remember who President McKinley was. We don't even remember how Teddy Roosevelt got to be president. When you don't remember your history, you repeat it. And so we have Mayor Bloomberg jacking up Syrian Christians thinking that they're Muslims in New York City because they run a bakery with a Middle Eastern name. And jacking up Muslims because they're Muslims, not because they're criminals. And throwing young black men up against the wall, probably because the police are afraid to go after the young white men. Why? Because in New York City, there ain't no poor white men. Right? There's no poor white people in New York City anymore. Like, those movies are about the Bronx or Brooklyn. They're not about, I mean, Little Italy is a movie set at this point. And you know what? You're not going to, and there are very few young, rich black boys in New York City walking home from school. And yet they get thrown against the wall too. I was talking to one of the top CEOs in New York City, whose son was wearing his school uniform, which his father hoped would help protect him the way that the necktie protects his father on his way to work, who was stopped and frisked the other day. No limits. And who suffers? My grandfather was in law enforcement for over 25 years in Baltimore. He was a probation officer. The man who shot me had a shoot. My best friend's dad was a California Highway Patrol officer. They were always very clear that law enforcement was underfunded and everything was a choice. If you were a probation officer, you could spend your time really focusing on the killers who might reoffend or the drug addicts who might just need a little bit more time to find a job. If you were a highway patrolman, who in California are also like the state police, you could spend your time following up on that homicide investigation or the reckless driving investigation, or you could spend your time giving tickets to people who are going 5 miles over the speed limit. The choice was yours. Well, right now in city after city, we have taken the broken window theory, which basically is an old theory that says, focus on the smallest thing, because if you don't, it becomes the biggest thing, to the extreme. And so in New York City, where every year there are homicides that go unsolved, and disproportionately in the poorest communities, and there are rapes that go unsolved disproportionately in the poorest communities, when we decide to do 280,000 stop and frisks, more than 80% of which, some say more than 90, well over 90% of which, find nothing. We are choosing to spend literally 280,000. You're talking about over 1 million hours when you add up the time for the stop and frisk and the reporting and everything else, on literally nothing. And therefore tolerating a homicide case close rate that's lower than it should be, a rape case close rate that's lower than it should be. That's what we have to understand. You see, in our society, we say that there's nothing more important to us than our children. We say there's nothing more important to us than education. And yet in our society, we increasingly, year after year, send more and more to incarceration and less to public higher education. Because what's true, the dirty secret of American politics, the only thing that trumps our love for our own children is our fear of somebody else's. My father told me when I was a kid, son, it's okay to be afraid. Everybody has fear. The question is, what do you do with it? If you act because of your fears, son, you're a coward. If you act in spite of your fears, you have the opportunity to be a hero. When I talk to young kids, even at the Trayvon Martin rally, the number one response I got from them when I said, what do you want to be as a police officer? At the Trayvon Martin rally. Because a young man wants to be a hero. Well, in today's America, to be a hero in law enforcement starts by recognizing that you are here to protect all of our citizens, all of our visitors, all of the people in this country. And you protect them by focusing on behavior. You protect them on focusing on what people do. And you protect them by respecting the fact that we all look differently. in this society, as we do in this room. In short, the answer to ending racial profiling is as simple as the answer to ending gender profiling for presidential assassins. All we have to do is wake up the next day and say, we're not going to do it anymore. When we look at the Trayvon Martin case, this case has struck a chord in this country because a deep chord, a chord that has Roseanne Barr writing about her fear for her son, because he's a young man who wears a hoodie and plays basketball, even though he's rich and he's white, and she's worried that the cops don't treat young men the way that they should. But also saying she worries more for his black friends, because she recognizes that they're treated differently, even though they're good kids. It struck a chord in our community, in other words, that runs deeper maybe than at any point before, because old lines have broken down more than they have before. Still there, but more broken down. Families have intermarried more than they have before. The country is becoming browner and blacker than it ever has been before. And we are becoming more, as far as our friendships, like that which our children pray for every day in school when they talk about one nation, indivisible. We just got to get our law enforcement to catch up. And I have confidence that we can do it. So those are the thoughts I wanted to bring to you today about racial profiling. We have known it's a problem for a long time. We know what the fix is. It is as simple and it is as complex as waking up tomorrow and saying we're not going to do it anymore. So for Trayvon Martin, I'm happy to take any questions about this case. But I also came here today, quite frankly, with some of that burden off my shoulders, because it looks like in a matter of hours, his killer is finally going to be charged. Thank you and God bless.
At this point, what we're going to do is we're going to take a few audience questions. So I'm just going to look for the first person to raise their hand, whoever has a question for Mr. Jealous.
How you doing? Great motivation. Has racial profile changed since we've had President Obama in office?
You know, what has definitely changed, I would say, is sort of the state of racism in the country. We have entered a more volatile period. Hate crimes have gone up. Membership in extremist white supremacist organizations has gone up. Racially tinged violence, it feels like in many areas, has gone up. I think the bigger, but we honestly, I think also don't know what impact the fact that, for instance, that the U.S. Senate hasn't had a hearing on racial profiling since before September 11th. In other words, that we were having a robust national conversation as we ended the last century about racial profiling and the need to end racism in law enforcement. George Bush in 1999-2000 was campaigning against racial profiling. And we haven't had that conversation for 10 years. And so I would say that sort of as concerning as it is maybe the response of some people to having the father of the nation be a black man, is the fact that we as a society got real scared after September 11th and stopped having a conversation that we needed to have if we were going to prevent what's happened to Trayvon Martin and so many other young people from happening.
Someone up here.
Good afternoon. Thank you for coming to our school. We really appreciate you taking the time to come and speak with us today. My question is going along the lines when you were talking about focusing on behavior and not on race. Some of my concerns that I've seen just happening throughout the world, and you mentioned September 11th, so on and so forth, war on terror, war on drugs, whatever. How do we prevent? How are we able to fight crime and crimes against people and against people, individuals in our country, without turning into a police state where they just start suspecting everyone who walks out their house?
again, you know, we have to be motivated by our love for our neighbors and our children, and therefore our desire to make people safe and be able to live their lives freely, rather than our fears. And the way that that plays out is, see, fear motivates you to do something that makes you feel good. Love motivates you to do the thing that's actually going to make your child safer. Fear gives you policies that we call tough on crime. Afraid of crackheads in the beginning of the crack war, and middle of the crack war was late 80s, early 90s, and so we say that we're going to make the punishment for possessing crack cocaine 100 times stiffer than powder, even though it has the exact same active ingredient. And we fill up our jails with low-level nonviolent offenders because 5 grams of crack at that point carried the same amount of punishment as half a kilo of powder. And so 2 rocks, we're going to send you away to 5 years mandatory federal time. And we filled up the jails with nonviolent offenders and increasingly women and mothers. And we sent our kids to foster care. And we broke up families. And we accelerated violence and criminality in our society. That's what tough on crime gets you. Criminologically, it is an abject failure. Sociologically, it makes a lot of people feel good to see a lot of young black folks being thrown up against the wall, including some black folks, if we're honest. Because they want to say that that's George Bush's law, or, it was also Charlie Rangel's law, right? Yes, no, exactly. Rockefeller was a liberal Republican, right? So what does smart on crime look like? Smart on crime is saying, you know what, it's 7 times more effective dollar for dollar to use drug rehab than incarceration. And so we're going to treat drug addiction like the medical issue that it is, and we're going to send people to rehab. And if we got to send them back, we'll send them back, because in our own lives, those of us who are addicts in our families know you often got to go through a couple of times. Smart on crime is we're going to spend less time busting johns and prostitutes and more time busting pimps. Smart on crime is the conversation we're having in Connecticut right now, where they're debating it into the death penalty. It looks like today they will vote to abolish the death penalty in Connecticut. Score 1 for the memory of Troy Anthony Davis. Smart on crime is saying, even for a family like mine, where our cousin's grandson was shot and killed just before I took this job, in the middle of the afternoon in Columbia, Maryland, where our family thought they had gone to get away from the ravages of West Baltimore. Somebody like my cousin saying, you know what? I don't want the death penalty for his killer. I would, one, they tend to use that for poor people exclusively, let's be honest, for black people disproportionately, but it's also expensive. And the politicians are telling me there ain't no extra money going around. So I'd rather they take that money, those extra hundreds of thousands of dollars per case that it costs to put somebody to death, rather than give them life without the possibility of parole, and send them to the homicide unit to hire more detectives. Because it's a better use of our law enforcement dollars to get the uncaught killers off the street than to kill the killers we've already caught and have in cages. The thing that happens when you go to smart on crime for tough on crime is you end up with fewer arrests, because you're going after bigger fish and more serious crimes, and yet society gets safer. There's a book by Smart on Crime written by Attorney General Campbell and Harris, the state of California, that I would recommend to anybody who's thinking about becoming a prosecutor or defense attorney, or even to people who are thinking about becoming a civil rights lawyer and really should become a prosecutor. Because the reality is right now that the criminal justice system, from the private prison lobbyists to ambitious prosecutors who are seeking the death penalty really to advance their own career more than any public safety aim, has control over our communities more than we, the people, have control over our criminal justice system.
Any questions in the back?
Hi, I was wondering what role you feel the prison industrial complex has in promoting racial biases, and that's pretty much it.
Well, you know, I think just from experience that the most powerful force is often local prosecutors who have a lot of power to get the media's attention on whatever they want to get the attention about, and have a way of sort of stirring up fear to promote their own career, even when crime is falling in their community, their state, their country. So I think that's actually sort of as far as the influence on local voters' mindsets, probably the most powerful part of our prison industrial complex as far as it relates to the media. When you look at the fact that we now have private companies building prisons, we should be worried about that. And there was a case in Pennsylvania in the last few years where 2 judges were convicted and sentenced for sending young people, children, who didn't need to go to prison, to privately owned prisons to keep the population levels up, and were taking kickbacks from the prisons. Now, I think that's an admittedly extreme case, and yet it speaks to a larger dynamic. Because there are, for those couple of judges, there are hundreds of state legislators taking political contributions from those prison companies, voting for laws that, if they actually studied the facts, are not in the interest of their communities. And what happens then is that they have to justify it. And they have to make the argument why they need this. And they come back to a fear-based argument that, again, often defies national crime trends. Violent crime in our country is now at like levels we haven't seen basically since the 1950s. But you wouldn't know that if you watched the nightly news. And so I think we are right to be concerned about that complex, but the only real antidote is us paying attention and getting organized and pushing back. In this state, that's why we were able to get rid of the Rockefeller drug laws. In this state, that's why we were able to get them to switch the census count, so now they count inmates where they're from and not at the prison where they are. And in states like Texas, that's how we've been able to actually strike back and team up, oddly enough, with the Tea Party and put through 12 major criminal justice reforms in Texas last year that were signed by Rick Perry, and has Texas now announcing they're shutting down their first prison ever, because we just looked at the issue and we looked at who we could get to agree with us. And the problem often is moderate Democrats who are afraid of looking soft on crime, afraid of being smart on crime. And so the Tea Party wasn't afraid of looking soft on crime. And they had libertarians, Christian evangelicals, and fiscal conservatives. And that was like hitting 3 cherries on a slot machine and having a common sense conversation about law enforcement and what's going on because the Christian evangelicals are in the prisons. They know that not only are black men 5 times more likely to be incarcerated than white men, but that our white men are the most incarcerated white men on the planet. A white man in America today is as likely to be incarcerated as a black man in South Africa during apartheid. That's how off the chain we were. At that point, South Africa was the world's leading incarcerator. So not only have we taken over the pole position in this race to be the world's leading incarcerator, we've taken it to a whole new level. It's also worth pointing out that the last 2 countries, including the former South African Republic, to hold that title no longer exist. Because along with fighting too many wars overseas, it's absolutely financially unsustainable. Which is the argument that gets the fiscal conservatives on your side. Because they understand how Rome fell apart. And the libertarians, well, most libertarians, if you just say drug law reform, you get them a drug. I'll just leave it there. Nope.
Okay, you cited the culprit mainly in racial profiling are the police. But if we're really looking at the reality, I mean, we all understand, hopefully, that your everyday teacher in the classroom also, very many of them are guilty of racial profiling our children. And it exceeds that, it goes beyond that even when you look at everyday citizens, and we are all familiar with the black doll, white doll test, and
Sure.
more recently, the test that they did.
Yeah,
Okay.
the implicit bias test.
Right,
Implicit bias.
exactly. So how do we try to alleviate certain biases or the racism institutionally that goes far beyond, and not just institutionally, but everyday racial profiling in the United States?
So the, first of all, it's a very valid point. I chose law enforcement examples because I think they're the most clear. But when you talk about racial profiling in our society, you're talking about basically anybody who has a mission that includes protecting and or punishing. And so it's police, it's private security, it's community watch, it's principals and teachers. Most important thing is data. We know what we know about the stop and frisk program in New York City because the ACLU sued them and forced them to do a FOIA and tell us who they were stopping and frisking and why. We know what we know now about school discipline. First, because a report was done in Texas last year, is the biggest report funded by the Pew Center. 1 million school children's discipline records were looked at, found no issue more determinative of whether or how a child will be punished than that child's race. But now, because the Obama administration has required all school districts of a sort of, well, most school districts, all of a certain size, to disaggregate their school discipline data and tell us who they're punishing and why. And this is a big problem. It's a big problem both because it happens on the front end of life, and therefore it can change people's lives when they're humiliated and mistreated in their own school. It's a big problem because it's extremely widespread. When I was working on the Troy Davis case in Savannah, Georgia, which is a real problem in the criminal justice system, and I was there for a while, so I decided to meet with some of the city fathers and mothers and leaders, and all that the white head of the county commission wanted to talk about and the black mayor wanted to talk about was their inability to get their school board to understand what a big problem the school discipline disparities were. They told me two stories. One was of a white kid who was a Boy Scout, and like Boy Scouts have when they're working on certain merit badges, ever since Boy Scouts have had cars, he had a small hatchet in the trunk of his car because he would go from home to school to hanging out with the Boy Scouts and practicing for his merit badge. And there's a zero tolerance policy on the campus. The zero tolerance policy says if you have any weapon, you're going to be punished. If it's in your locker or if it's in the trunk of a car parked on or near school grounds. And so they did a random check of students that day. They checked his trunk. They found his hatchet. They gave him 2-day suspension. His parents were outraged. He was outraged. They were outraged. This is ridiculous. The kid shouldn't have been punished this way. A few months later, same high school, black student, star athlete, star student. They found tableware in his trunk. Spoon, a fork, and a knife. Not a steak knife, just a knife, bread knife, dull knife. 2 weeks suspension. Exactly the minimum required in the state of Georgia to force you to repeat the entire next academic year. He did 5 years of high school because he had a spoon, a fork, and a knife. The reality is that public education has gotten maybe as far as desegregation, but we haven't gotten to integration. Integration is what our kids pray for every day. It's one nation, under God, indivisible, liberty and justice for all. It's all of us being treated the same way, all of our kids being loved. And that, years ago, I went to my grandmother, 95 years old now, third generation member of the NAACP. First in her family, common ancestor, Damon and I, great-great-grandfather, her grandfather, and his grandmother's grandfather. Was born a slave, died a state senator, co-founded Virginia State along the way. And my grandmother, I can remember when I was young, Damon was just born, said to me that we were going to be the first generation that didn't have to fight. We're a family been in the NAACP for 4 generations. The 5th generation, we wouldn't have to fight. It was go out and do it if you want to. Jesse Jackson, if you want to, it's kind of a nostalgia thing. If you want to, go feel like you're doing something. Our job was simply to reap what they had sown. They had killed Jim Crow just like their grandparents had helped kill slavery. Our job was to reap what they had sown. We would be the first generation of Americans judged by the content of our character, not the color of our skin or the kink of our hair or whose grandchild we were. And I remember I was about 20 years old and was at a birthday party for a friend of mine who was turning 21. Long story short, somebody poured libations of memory for all of our friends who had died before we even got to college, in the middle of those crack wars and those drug wars. And then somebody tried to turn the mood around and held a toast, the fact that one more of us had survived to 21. And I just couldn't hold my glass, and it just cut me like a knife. This notion that a man of any race in our society, I don't care what the realities are, had his hope reduced for any group, let alone his own group, so low that he thought that breathing past his 21st birthday was an accomplishment. At a time when we had 8-year-olds in Southeast D.C. planning their funerals, you could see how it might make sense, but it was deeply depressing. And I went to my grandmother and I said, "What happened?" And she said, "Baby, it's sad, but it's simple. We got what we fought for, but we lost what we had. We got the right to be police officers, but we lost safe communities. We got the right to go to any school we wanted to, but we lost the right to send our children to any school and know that they would be loved by every teacher in the building." And that is the challenge for education in America today. Whenever we get to the point that we look at all of the children of this country as the way that Jack Kemp did, when I was speaking with him in South Central Los Angeles 10 years ago, 12 years ago, and he was going off about they're all our kids. All our kids, our kids, our kids, our kids. And he was talking about the kids of South Central LA, and this little black lady looked a little bit like my great aunt standing next to me, 85 years old, leaned over me and said, "Baby?" I said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "Where's he from?" I said, "Ma'am, that's Jack Kemp. He ran for," "Yeah, I thought I recognized him. He's not from here, is he?" I said, "No, ma'am." "So what does he mean, our kids?" And I said, "Ma'am, I think what he means is we're all Americans, and these are all American children, and they're all our kids." That's our number one challenge in this country. Think about how many adjectives we put before the word child. That black child, that poor white child, that rich white kid. It's one thing if that's just sort of a pattern of speech with no import, but it has profound implications on our policymaking, on who we punish, on who we nurture, and unfortunately at this point in history, on our global competitiveness. And if we can solve that, a lot of good things will follow.
All right, we're going to have to wrap up, so let's have one more round of applause for
Thank you.
Ben Jealous.
I hope you guys will indulge me. I do have to go back home tonight, and I failed to recognize my sister-in-law's brother-in-law, Professor Farley. And I'll see him at Thanksgiving too. So anyways, thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
Try to be. What? I'll try to be, yeah. Let's give it 2 minutes before he...
I don't want to change the gender too quickly. I'll sit behind the right.
Oh, you think it's gonna transform?
Do you have an order preference? Okay, I'm first. All right.
So,
I'll go last. If it would be a good time.
yeah, step it back.
All right, so just signal. So you're third, I think. Third?
Water in here.
I did not.
Want to switch? I think they'll go right across. Okay.
Want Dean Mayer to meet. Damon's been in every one of my classes, so I figure I got an in.
Yeah.
I'm going to speak from up there because I'm so short.
Oh, yeah, no problem.
Hi. Hey, Sam.
Hello, everyone. Hope everyone's enjoying themselves. My name is Chet Godley. I'm Vice President of the Black Law Student Association, and I'm here today to introduce our panel, which will be continuing our discussion on racial profiling and criminal justice. Our first panelist is Professor Laurie Shanks. Excuse me. Professor Shanks joined Albany Law in 1989. Prior to joining Albany Law, Professor Shanks was in private practice in Phoenix, Arizona, concentrating on criminal defense and personal injury litigation. He was the training director for the Maricopa County Public Defender's Office and a judge pro tem. Professor Shanks teaches CLE seminar programs and trial advocacy workshops throughout the nation, serves as a member of the Judicial Screening Panel for the Women's Bar Association and a referee for the New York State Commission on Judicial Conduct. Our second panelist today is Professor Sundquist. Excuse me. I gotta find where we're at. Okay. Oops. Excuse me. Professor Sundquist is a rising star in legal academia and has been with Albany Law School since 2006. Prior to joining Albany Law School faculty, Professor Sundquist was an associate at Chadbourne and Park in New York City and served as a senior editor on the Georgetown Poverty Law Journal. Professor Sundquist's work has been published in the New York University Annual Survey for American Law, the Temple Journal of Science, Technology, and American Law, and the Harvard Black Letter Law Journal. His scholarship can be found at raceandlaw.com. Our third panelist, excuse me, Mr. Brendan Cox, is the Assistant Chief of Police of the Albany Police Department. He has been with Albany Police Department since February of 1994. He was promoted to sergeant in April of 1997 and eventually served as a detective sergeant in the Children and Family Services Unit. In March of 2004, he was promoted to lieutenant, and after serving a short time in charge of the Albany Police Department's Special Operations Unit, returned as detective lieutenant in charge of the Children and Family Services Unit. In November of 2006, he was promoted to commander and oversaw the detective division. In June 2008, he was promoted to Assistant Chief in charge of operations. Assistant Chief Cox has a Bachelor of Science in Criminal Justice from the University of Dayton and a Master of Public Administration from Marist College. He is married and has 2 children. And our final panelist today is Professor Anthony Paul Farley. Professor Farley is Albany Law School's James Campbell Matthews Distinguished Professor of Jurisprudence. Prior to teaching at Albany Law School, Professor Farley taught 16 years at Boston College Law School and previously served as an assistant United States attorney in Washington, D.C., and an associate with Sherman and Sterling in New York City. Professor Farley specializes in constitutional law, criminal procedure, and legal theory, and has held visiting appointments at CUNY Law School, Northeastern University Law, Golden Gate University Law School, and Acadian School of Psychoanalysis. A graduate of Harvard Law School, Professor Farley's work has appeared countless times in both chapter form and our nation's leading scholarly legal journals. Each panelist will be making a 5 to 10 statement before we take questions from the audience. So without ado, we will start with Professor Shanks.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for coming, and to the Black Law students for arranging this very impressive day. One of the things that I have noticed, I have been following the Trayvon Martin case. I'm sure most of the rest of you have. And it's interesting to me as someone, I was a prosecutor before I was a public defender, and I was a public defender before I became a law school professor, so I guess I spend way too much time analyzing things. But one of the interesting things to me was that the things that people are saying and who's saying them have been sort of turned on their head. Professor Sundquist sent me a website of a program that was held at an American university. And Angela Davis, who I've known for years and who's one of just the most impressive criminal defense lawyers in the nation, was doing an opening statement and a closing argument as the prosecutor in the Trayvon Martin case. I, at the request of my husband, listened to talk radio as I was driving in today. And suddenly they're really interested in the safety of people who are charged with crimes. They want to make sure that if Mr. Zimmerman is arrested today, that he is protected because the mob is likely to get him. And they're not sure that he's going to get a fair trial. And I was thrilled to think that now they're really going to be concerned about whether or not people get a fair trial, because in the couple other times I've been forced to listen, I've never heard them be concerned about that. And in fact, they usually don't even think that there's a need for a trial at all, because once someone's arrested, they just listen to Nancy Grace or Rush, and they know what the verdict should be. So I started to ask myself, why is it that suddenly the people who normally are really interested in probable cause and stop and frisk and racial profiling are now ready to do a closing argument on a trial in which no one has been arrested? And while people who normally think you should literally execute first and then not have an appeal, sorry about that, are suddenly very concerned with whether or not he has a good lawyer and whether or not he's going to get a fair trial. So I'm going to come back to that, but for a moment, if you will indulge me, I would like everyone to just kind of close their eyes. And I want you to envision this. I'm going to tell you a story about something that happened to my son, Jacob, who some of you know. Jake just had his 22nd birthday, and he is a senior at Temple in Philadelphia. In fact, while you have your eyes closed, if you want to say a prayer that he actually graduates, that would be great also. But when Jake was a freshman, he was very excited about being in a big city. He was ready to be out of Albany. He loved the school, and he met a girl. And she gave him her address, which we found out later happened to be a few blocks away from Temple. And if any of you know that area, there's a few rough areas of town outside the university, and Jacob got lost. And he found he was sort of dancing in the street. My son is a dancer. And he was sort of dancing in the street and listening to his iPod and realized that he was hopelessly lost. And he found there were two young people who were on a stoop, and he talked to them and told them that he was lost and asked for directions to the girl's house. He had her address. And they sent him down a street a couple blocks away, very dark street. And when he got a couple blocks in, he was confronted by someone who put a gun in his face and stole his cell phone and his $7, which I actually was impressed that he had that much. That was kind of unusual for him. So first, I just want you to imagine that much and say to yourselves, who do you think was wearing a hoodie in this scenario? Huh? My son. Who else? Huh? The person with the gun. Who else? The two kids on the stoop. Everybody was wearing a hoodie. It was, late September in Philadelphia in the middle of the night. So everyone was wearing a hoodie. You don't need to raise your hands, but I would like you to just think about how did you envision what my son looked like, what his friend who was with him looked like, what the kids on the stoop looked like, and what the man who had the gun, and it was a man, I didn't talk about gender, but the man with the gun looked like. So time passes, he calls his mother, who becomes quite hysterical about the fact that my child has just been robbed at gunpoint, and I tell him that he needs to talk to the police. He needs to call and make a police report. And so he goes back to his dorm, and the dorm calls the police department, and so someone from the Philadelphia Police Department comes to the dorm to interview him, and he tells them what happened, okay? And they tell him that the two kids on the stoop set him up and set him down the dark roadway and called their compatriot to come rob him at gunpoint, okay? My son's response to the police officers was, "You're racial profiling." This is what happens if you're raised by two criminal defense lawyers. Okay? The police response to my son was, "You're an idiot." Your parents and those professors at Temple are all liberal idiots, okay? Now, what really happened? What really happened? Did the two kids really set Jake up? Well, we'll never know, okay? Because after determining that my son was an idiot, the police didn't do any further investigation, okay? They decided basically he got what he deserved. That was their parting shot as he walked out the door. And that next time, if he wasn't going to be any more helpful, he probably would get killed. Cheerful for his mom. So what do we know? What we really know about that is not whether or not the kids on the stoop were really trying to get Jake to the girl's house or safely back to his dorm. We don't know whether or not they really were part of a gang that was determined to steal $7 from Temple kids. But what we do know is that there was an absolute failure to have any meeting of the minds between someone who was the victim of a crime and several people whose job it was to ensure that my son and everyone else's son and daughter were safe in that city. So why does it make a difference? We're here, certainly there are members of the community here, which I appreciate, but there's also many of you out there I see are my students. And many of my students want to become prosecutors, want to become criminal defense lawyers, want to become civil rights lawyers. So why does it matter? And why it matters is think back to when you were first-year students, and we talk a lot in law school about what we do in a trial is that we find the facts and we apply the law to the facts, and that's how we come to a decision, whether it's the jurors who come to a decision, whether it's a judge that comes to a decision, whether it's an appellate court that comes to a decision. That's what we do. We find the facts and we then apply the law, and then we have a just conclusion. But implicit in that, inherent in that statement or that concept is that we are somehow able to find the facts, and that there will be an agreement on what the facts are. And I suggest to you that in almost all criminal cases in which I have been involved, either as a prosecutor or a defense attorney, that's simply not true. Jake's version or Jake's belief as to what the facts were, and the police belief as to what the facts were are not the same. The defense lawyer who is ready to make a closing argument and convict, ask a jury to convict George Zimmerman of murder of Trayvon Martin, and the folks who say this is mob violence and George Zimmerman needs to be protected, do not have a common view of what the facts are. So we then cannot apply the law to the facts and come up with what will either really be a just result or will be perceived by anyone to be a just result. Because the prior experiences of everyone involved come into play. All of the questions that were asked here about what children experience in school, you know, what dolls they prefer, what they imagine will happen when their child goes out on the street, whether or not they're concerned about whether or not what clothing they put their child in will make them safer or less safe. The implicit bias, the explicit bias of everyone involved, the victims, the witnesses, the police, the prosecutor, the defense attorney, the jurors, the judge, are all going to have an impact. When students say to me, and you know, Mr. Jealous was talking about that the most power now is within the local prosecutors. When students say to me, what should I do if I want to make the most impact? Should I be a prosecutor? Should I be in private practice? Should I be a defense attorney? I tell them they need to be all of those things. Because it is only when we have different people with different views and a commitment to ensure that the prayer of equal justice is honored. Only when all of the participants have that commitment will we not have to have a gathering with this topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Shanks. Our next panelist is Professor Sundquist.
So I'll try to keep my comments brief because I see folks, are heading to the doorways. Ben Jealous finished his amazing remarks, but hopefully we have some interesting topics to discuss. And I do want to pick up on something that President Jealous spoke to earlier, and that's fear and reasonableness of fear and how fear influences how we view the facts, picking up on what Professor Shanks was talking about, and in particular how fear influences our interpretation of objective reasonableness, at least from a legal standpoint, and also from a social standpoint. And as President Jealous once reminded us in the past, one key root of racial disparities in criminal justice is promulgating this fear, promulgating the fear specifically of black men and in order to protect the white community, equating blackness, equating male blackness with criminality, of course, historically has been used to entrench power and this racial status quo by rationalizing police control of the black community, as well as rationalizing and justifying higher incarceration rates for black men especially. And if you think about the Trayvon Martin case, I'm not sure if there's been any new developments. My understanding is that a press conference has been scheduled for around 6 p.m. So if we believe the reports to be true, charges are forthcoming, which is a good thing. But if we think about the Trayvon Martin case and we think about some of the facts, at least some of the undisputed facts, it follows a very disturbing racial pattern that was typical in Jim Crow days, that was typical during segregation, and remains obviously relevant today in the sense that, number one, police have discounted the value of a black victim. Number two, that police have accepted as true and as objectively reasonable, without double checking, the allegations of the white assailant, which is debatable, Zimmerman, that police have failed to charge this man who unlawfully killed an innocent black man, and police have stated that the black victim was really the aggressor. Right? So, and I think if you think about this pattern of facts, and you think about the Trayvon Martin case, we'll see a lot of historical patterns of racial power and control playing out here. And these are historical patterns that continue to exist and are played out in the Martin case. And indeed, these patterns have become exacerbated over the last several decades. During lunch with Ben Jealous, he noted, and this is a very true fact, that if you think about the level of incarceration of black men following the Civil War, during the Reconstruction period, it was approximately 2 black men were incarcerated for every 1 white man, right? Around 2-to-1 ratio. Today it's 5-to-1. So it's gone through the roof. And yet if we improperly equate blackness with criminality, then the objective reasonableness of viewing black men as criminals is established in the mindset, right? And if it's reasonable to view black men with criminal suspicion, then it's just one more step, in my view, to see it as logical to discount the lives of black victims and to recast those same victims as criminal aggressors. And that's exactly what happened to Trayvon. It's just one more step to see it as reasonable to fully credit the one-sided account of the white or non-black aggressor and recast those aggressors as innocent victims, which is what happened with Zimmerman. There's an old saying, I'm not sure if you've heard it, but the saying, which I absolutely believe to be true, is that the oldest race card in the book is the denial that racism still exists, right? And so that's what we're dealing with today. And certainly there's the likelihood of explicit racial bias in this case, based not only on some of Zimmerman's statements contained on the 911 calls, based not only on the actions and comments of members of the police department themselves, but I would like to very briefly, for argument's sake, address the claim of non-racism in this case, and specifically of implicit racial bias, right? And so this is an argument that is made to argue that Zimmerman's actions were objectively reasonable under a legal framework or a social framework. And if we think about this, we know a number of facts that run counter. Number one, that social science has conclusively established the pervasiveness of both explicit racial bias and discrimination and implicit racial bias in today's purportedly post-racial world, right? And I want to share one study because I think it is particularly appropriate to what's going on here. And the fact of this racial bias wrongly distorts how we view the reasonableness of actions, right? How we view the reasonableness of lethal force, how we view the reasonableness of an arrest or non-arrest, of prosecution or non-prosecution, of viewing black victims of perpetrators, so on and so forth. And so in this particular study, researchers showed a series of images of individuals to test subjects. In some of those images, the person had a gun. In other images, the person was unarmed, right? And the participants were told to shoot at the images that had a gun. And the study found that test subjects significantly shot unarmed black suspects at a way higher rate than armed or unarmed white suspect. That test subjects would pause when a white image was shown and were much less likely to shoot an unarmed white person. And they repeated the study with police officers and found the exact same results. And their conclusion was that race impacted the subject's conclusions as to whether or not a suspect was criminally dangerous, right? And so this same type of implicit racial thinking could have impacted Zimmerman's unjust acts, as well as the police interpretation of the facts before them. And so let's go back to the legal standard of reasonableness. I do want to talk a little bit about some of the doctrine that Zimmerman's account seemed objectively reasonable to the police officers investigating, to Police Chief Bill Lee, who said, well, there's no reason to not believe what Zimmerman is telling us to be true, so we'll stop our investigation of the facts, right? So to Bill Lee and to some of the other police officers investigating, this story seemed absolutely reasonable on its face. There's no need to look further. And reasonable person standard, the objective reasonable standard is, of course, very, very familiar to law students in attendance today. It's manifest in law, in our torts law, our con law, our criminal law. Yet our history of associating blackness with criminality in order, again, to maintain patterns of racial inequality, as well as clear evidence of the pervasiveness of racial bias, even today, of explicit bias and implicit bias, I think is important to recognize when we attempt to apply this objective legal standard of reasonableness to some set of facts, right? And indeed, when we consider the legal aspects of this case, most of the critical legal issues hinge on our particular understanding of reasonableness, of the reasonableness of Zimmerman viewing Trayvon as a criminal suspect on drugs. I think he's on drugs. Of the reasonableness of police casting Trayvon not as the victim, even though he was laying face down on the ground with a gunshot to his chest, but as the aggressor. Of the reasonableness of viewing Zimmerman's claim of self-defense. And so in my time remaining, I'll just briefly talk about self-defense and stand your ground law. In order to invoke a self-defense claim, many states, including Florida, require that a defendant have a reasonable belief that the victim posed a threat, and that person is justified to use lethal force only if the person reasonably, right, using this objective standard, believes that force is necessary to prevent imminent death or serious bodily harm. And in many states, self-defense is not available if the defendant had the ability to retreat from the situation. This is a duty to retreat. Florida eliminated this last portion with their stand your ground law. So they eliminated the duty to retreat, largely due to NRA lobbying. That's another story. But stand your ground, I think, should not become an issue in this case, as self-defense using lethal force is available only under very, very limited circumstances. It is generally not available to a person that, under Florida law, that initially provokes the use of force against themselves unless that force is so great they reasonably believe that they're in danger of dying, or they withdraw from the situation, and they clearly state to the other person, I'm withdrawing from this situation. I did attack you initially, or I approached you initially, but I'm stepping back, but is nonetheless pursued, right? And that's the only situations in which this would hold up. Yet, if we think about some of the facts, and more facts will come undoubtedly. He hasn't been charged yet even, right? But if we think about what we know, the statements on 911 tapes, the timeline, and so forth, the facts show that Trayvon was the victim of stalking, of being pursued, which, if anything, created a right for him to stand his ground to Zimmerman. A couple last points. Evidence shows that Zimmerman was the aggressor, and it's extremely unlikely he will be able to rely on the stand your ground provision. He killed Martin after pursuing him in his car. He told the dispatcher he thought Martin was on drugs, even though Martin was only having an innocent and coherent conversation with his girlfriend at the time, when he told his girlfriend that some strange dude was following him, was chasing him, and he was scared, and he was trying to escape. Against the instructions, the orders of the police dispatcher, Zimmerman left the car to confront and pursue Martin, and that he initiated contact with Martin, who was simply returning home, as we know, from the store after buying tea and candy. And even if stand your ground is seen as applying here, which I don't think it is, it doesn't mean that police should not have arrested Zimmerman. It doesn't mean that police did not have probable cause. Any use of force must be proportional to the threat in order to invoke self-defense. So regardless of who was the initial aggressor, Zimmerman still must be able to show that a reasonable person would have believed that his death was imminent or that serious harm was imminent. But again, you think about the facts as we know it, mostly from the 911 tapes and the statements of what we should believe are objective witnesses who overheard some of what happened. Zimmerman was an adult. He had a gun. He knew police were on the way. He had been talking to them for some time. Yet Martin, who's a child, a minor, was unarmed. He thought he was being stalked and attacked by a strange dude. Martin is 80 to 100 pounds lighter than Zimmerman. I know he's 6'3". I was 6'3". When I was around his age, I weighed about 140 pounds. So, lightness, that matters in terms of a physical altercation. All witnesses identify Martin or a child as the one who is screaming in terror for help. Witnesses say that it wasn't self-defense, in their opinion, since they didn't hear any prolonged fighting, they didn't hear any punching so far, just crying from a child, a gunshot, and then silence. The girlfriend says that Martin was trying to escape Zimmerman and was afraid. Zimmerman was in his car. He was safe in his car. He didn't sound afraid on the 911 tapes. He was ordered by police not to approach Martin. And Zimmerman admitted to approaching him nonetheless and confronting him. And he says, "What are you doing here?" And if we think about, again, some of the limited things we know about the injuries, the injury to Zimmerman doesn't seem to be proportional to the force he used, right? Doesn't seem to be sufficiently severe based even on the enhanced photos. He was coherent, he was walking around. EMS wasn't called at all, wasn't dispatched to give him aid. There are no injuries on Trayvon to suggest that he was an aggressor in the fight, on his fists, that sort of thing. And we have a complete corroboration of the account by eyewitnesses that Trayvon was the victim. And so the facts, as we know them, simply do not suggest that Zimmerman was justified. Quite the contrary, they suggest that Trayvon was justified in fearing Zimmerman. One other thing that I heard Ben Jealous mention at an earlier talk, but this is also an old saying, that probable cause is a fairly easy standard to meet. And here's the saying, that it's so broad that a competent prosecutor can get an indictment for a ham sandwich, right? So that's a very common saying. I don't think we teach that as a matter of law, at least I hope we don't, but we're fairly familiar with it. That is so easy to get. Yeah, exactly. And so obviously that's not the standard, but government does need to show that there is a reasonable possibility that the defendant committed a crime. There's no need to prove that the crime actually occurred, right? It's just that weighing all the facts, the totality of the circumstances, that a reasonable person could believe that Zimmerman committed some crime. Whether it's first-degree murder, second-degree murder, assault, whatever it happens to be, could believe that Zimmerman committed a crime. And I'd like to think that myself, I'd like to think that Ben Jealous, I'd like to think that many of the people in this room would be viewed as objectively reasonable people, right? And this minimum is easily satisfied here, and I think that's why we've been told, or it's been reported, that the special prosecutor in the case agrees and that probable cause is satisfied, that even if police officers, even if Zimmerman were influenced by implicit racial bias or explicit racial bias, there's only a need to show a reasonable possibility that Zimmerman committed some crime by shooting a black child in the chest, and then he died. I have a number of other things to talk about, but I know we are limited on time. I do want to respond to one question, just for a concluding remark. One question was posed to Ben Jealous earlier. What can we do? Especially what can we do in the face of mounting evidence that racial bias, racial discrimination, either from an explicit standpoint or implicit, continues to exist? I'd like to pick up on Ben Jealous's remarks. There have been showings that when you make race salient, that when you insert race into the dialogue, you make it explicit and you confront it. You confront privilege, you confront discrimination and the ongoing legacy of discrimination, that people behave in a less biased fashion, right? And so hopefully that's something that we're trying to achieve right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sundquist. Our next panelist is Brandon Cox, Assistant Chief Police of the Albany Police Department.
Thank you. Good afternoon. First of all, on behalf of Chief Krokoff and the entire police department, I really want to thank the law school, the Black Law Student Association, for inviting us and having us at the table. I think it's very important that we are part of the conversation. For us to not be part of the conversation is either would be on our behalf of us putting our heads in the sand and saying, you guys talk about whatever you want, it's not happening, or or the community not understanding that we need to solve this issue together. So it's very, we're very appreciative of the fact that we are here. As a panel member today, I was excited, very excited to come and listen to Mr. Jealous and hear what he had to say, and also to sit with my colleagues here to really make sure that we're working together to make sure that all citizens' constitutional rights are upheld and honored, because that is my number one charge as a police officer, is to uphold people's constitutional rights and to make sure that we are not inappropriately or improperly violating their rights. And we're supposed to do that no matter what their race, ethnicity, national origin, religion, or sexual orientation is. It doesn't matter. That's not supposed to happen. Now, in reality, are there issues? Absolutely. And those are issues that we need to address. So one of the things I was asked to address today as a panel member is what the Albany Police Department is doing to try to ensure that we don't racially profile. And if in fact we do, what we're doing to remedy that. There's a couple of points I want to talk about things that we have been able to implement under Chief Krokoff and we've been able to try to move forward on. One of them is a major philosophical change that we started going back about 4 years now, and that is changing back to a community policing model. And in community policing, as it says, the community and the police get together and problem solve. What that has enabled us to do is to go away from a data-driven model. Not that data is not important, because it is very important for a number of reasons, but instead of being an occupying force in our neighborhood, we would go back to being a partner in our neighborhoods, and we would work with the community to make sure we problem solve. Now, we didn't think just by us standing on a corner, stopping everybody to walk by, that we were going to solve all of the ills of society, because we're not, nor can we on our own. We can only do that by working together. So by coming back to a community policing model, we are trying to break down barriers, many of those barriers that exist no matter what, many of those barriers that historically drive how things happen in society. One of the biggest positive fashions that comes out of community policing is trying to have our officers work in the same area, the same times, all the time, and get to know the community members. Because I know I'm a big believer that if we know one another, that some of the misunderstandings that occur every day in this country won't occur. Because if I know your name and you know my name, and I see you on the street, it's certainly less likely that I'm going to go, you know what, I think he's up to something. When I know who Mark is, and I go, it's Mark Bobson. I can talk to him. I don't need to go, what's he up to? I know the people that I serve. That's very important. Some of the other things we did in our community policing model is we got input from the community. We started an advisory committee. So they could come in and talk with us and go, okay, we're going to be the liaison to my individual community, and we're going to come in and we're going to try to discuss issues that happen. We're going to try to solve problems, and we're going to have recommendations so we can continue to build. On top of that, in really trying to think on a community-based model, we are trying to be, as Mr. Jealous said, smart on policing. We are trying to understand that the criminal justice system cannot, on its own, solve all issues. So let's talk about violence. One of the things that we're trying to do and that we are moving forward on is understanding that in violence, there is a true public health model. The violence that occurs every day on the streets in this country is ultimately affecting everyone. There's no one it really does not affect. So we are openly working with groups that are there to help us solve that without necessarily just, hey, let's just throw cuffs on somebody, throw them away, and that'll solve the problems, because we know that doesn't happen. We're actively working with groups like SNUG, where we can have other folks, previously convicted offenders, help work with our citizens, especially our young people in the community, to try to understand that violence is not the way. So beyond community policing, some of the other things that are going on. We have implemented an early warning system in our Office of Professional Standards. Our Office of Professional Standards is our Internal Affairs Bureau. That system enables us to get a better look, a whole picture, a dashboard look at what our officers are doing, where complaints are coming in, what issues they're having, if there's leave issues, whatever they are, so we can fix those at an earlier point in time. The other thing we do is we work with the Citizens Review Board that the law school here helped support. While I'm on that topic, one of the things I'll say, and I know that in reading some of the material, especially Mr. Jealous's material, there were a lot of things that were spoken about and brought up in forums that never made it to formal complaints. And that's understandable because people fear that they're going to have retribution against them for coming forward and filing complaints. That is another reason why we're trying to break down barriers, so people are not afraid to come tell us when something's wrong. If an officer does something wrong, we need to know that so we can fix it. And on the same token, if a crime happens, we need to know that. And if there's no trust or faith from the community, then people are going to go, you know what? Very similar to what happened in Philadelphia. Man, you know what? I'm never calling them again. What did I get? I got a rash of, an earful because I called. Some of the other things we're trying to do is we're trying to revamp how we deal with the juvenile justice system. We've been lucky enough to be a recipient of a grant from the Department of Criminal Justice Services for the state, where we are going to do a front-end justice reform. And what that is we are going to, when we have a youth between the ages of 7 and 15, excuse me, which is a juvenile delinquent, if they are facing a juvenile delinquency charge, we are going to have a team of community members from community-based organizations come do an assessment, help us out, and make some recommendations on what we should do. And the hope of that is that some of the disproportionate minority contact in the juvenile justice system will decrease because we will get more kids into services without sending them through the juvenile justice system. We will refer them out instead of making that arrest. The other thing we're trying to do is a continued training for our officers for cultural competency and interpersonal skills. Interpersonal skills are huge because if we can't talk to somebody, we can't do our job. And if we tell our officers that very, very, very young on, if you can't talk to somebody, you're not going to do very good on your job. In cultural competency, we have to understand everyone. And we have to understand that we have to see how things are, how people see things through their eyes when something's happening. One such example of this is a project that the police department has with the school district to work with the National Coalition of Building Institute to improve on our youth police relationships. Anybody that's from this area know that there's been a historical issue, especially at our schools at dismissal time. But we're trying to break down some of the barriers and have better conversations with our kids, so that way we can go, okay, we know each other, we know how you feel, you know how we feel, we see where each other are coming from, now let's figure out a better way than just herding everybody down Central Avenue. And then there's also working with the community on stuff just like this, or at Dr. Green's forum on the new Jim Crow Act. It's new Jim Crow laws, excuse me. It's very important that we come and we are partners. That wasn't always true on both halves. We weren't always willing to come, and we weren't necessarily always invited, and that's because of a lot of the historical issues. We're here, we want to be here, and we want to continue. The last thing I really want to bring up, and a young lady up here, and I think she left, had mentioned this before. One of the things that I think we need help with in law enforcement is we need to educate our citizens. Because I can tell you that sometimes we feel like we're a pawn. I'm going to bring two examples up, and one when I was a young cop back in the early 90s. Working the division desk, I was benched for the day. When I was a young cop, I didn't like to be on the desk, but we all had to do our rounds. So on the desk, as a police officer at the station, you handle citizen complaints. Phone rings, answer the phone, Division I Officer Cox. Hi, this is Mrs. Smith up on Avenue A. We got two black kids walking down the street. That's all I hear. I go, okay. Well, what's the problem? Two young black kids walking down the street. I'm still trying to figure out what the problem is, ma'am. Is somebody doing something? It's like, no. Okay. What's the problem? Well, they look out of place. Well, I hate to tell you, but I think there's some constitutional law and there's some Supreme Court cases that give them a right to be in any part of town. So I'm a little confused what we're going to do, man. That's a real call. Those are things that happen. The other thing is 9/11. Obviously, a horrible, horrible tragedy, a horrible day for this country. I can't tell you how many calls we received from that day on of two, it was famous, and I think it's throughout the country. I don't know how many people got this, but, hey, there's two Middle Eastern males in a van. Okay. Thank you. Thanks for calling. But that's something that, as a community, we need to educate each other on. That, once again, that's profiling. And there are a lot of people that are guilty of it, and many times in law enforcement, we become a pawn for that. And what's important, that we don't allow ourselves to become that pawn, that we make sure we keep ourselves in check. So I was looking at all the material and a lot of the different things, and we've had some internal discussions department-wide. We can't go out fishing and tell our guys to take a net, cover the Atlantic Ocean, and just pick everything up and we'll solve all the problems. Because we're going to take in much more collateral damage than if we make sure we stay specific, we stay smart, and we stay focused on behaviors, not just looks of people. So once again, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Cox. And our final panelist for today is Professor Farley.
Let's all be police officers for a moment. We're 50-something, out of shape. The Dunkin' Donuts seem to be cropping up all over the place. The gray hairs coming in. We're kind of unsatisfied. Maybe I sprained my ankle doing something the other day. I can't tell what. Life hasn't turned out quite the way I planned it. Right? I'm having a crisis. Not an NAACP crisis, right, the newsletter of the NAACP, but a crisis that is still political. Gosh, what to do? Well, it's night. Twilight, perhaps. Why don't I slip into my cruiser and look for young black boys, wherever the young black boys hang out? I like my cruiser. I like cruising around in my cruiser. I like wearing my uniform. I like the way the shiny badge looks when I look at it in the mirror. It makes me feel better about myself. I look out the window. What do I look at? I look at things that attract me, right? There is an erotic quality to the gaze, isn't there? What you look at is what has drawn your eye. What draws your eye? What draws the police officer's eye? What draws the long arm of the law to clasp you roughly by the shoulder and spin you around and ask you, what's your name, who's your daddy? If he's not rich like me, then they might frisk you, and the frisk isn't a gentle frisk, is it? It's not even the turn your head and cough that you might have done if you're a boy and if you did sports when you're a boy. It's another kind of turn your head and cough. Feeling you on your outer clothing, patting you down, not to buy new. You're not buying a new suit. That's not why this strange man's hand is between your young legs. Has anyone been in this position? With an old person touching you in ways that you don't want them to touch you? Have I freaked anyone out? None of you should have been freaked out, right? There's a kind of sexuality that dares not speak its name. We pretend that cases like Abner Louima are aberrations. We pretend that there's something else going on when old men in their cars go out looking for young, poor boys to victimize. It's so much easier to victimize the poor. When that quality of availability gives them such an erotic charge that they abandon their job function to pursue young black boys. Oh, I could be pursuing crime, but I'd rather be out here pursuing these young black boys. I like handcuffing them. I like cruising around in my car with them. I like getting them in the back seat with handcuffs on because that's what I'm into. I like talking to my friends about them. I like writing reports about them. I like rolling their fingers over the ink to keep a permanent record, a little photograph, and I take photographs too, if you will, about them. I like doing the things that enable me to get more of them. I like turning them out so they will turn up more and more at night. Turning them out, is that too old-fashioned a word? Do we know what it is to be turned out? Made a recidivist? Because that's what prison gives you. When you put somebody into prison, you're not trying to cure them. Prison never cured anybody of criminality. We know from study after study, year after year, that what we get from prison is recidivism. I know this. I was a prosecutor for 3 years and 2 weeks in the largest U.S. attorney's office in the country. Nobody fighting the war on drugs thought they were winning. There is no war on drugs. There is no war on drugs. People like drugs. Who went to college? People like drugs. Who would take more than, because if you graduated, right, even if you didn't, who would take more than 5 minutes to go bust the local dope dealers if you had to at your college, at your alma mater? Would it take you more than 5 minutes to find some dope if you had to? I'm not going to continue until I hear an answer. All right, well, I want to talk about fairy tales and fighting crime, because fighting crime is a fairy tale. We don't worry about crime. We like our prisons, though. We've got more of them than the People's Republic of China. We've got more than the former Soviet Union. We've got more of them than apartheid-era South Africa. We have a heck of a lot more than Sweden, which doesn't really have any. But everywhere in Sweden is safer than anywhere in the United States. But that doesn't make us abandon our prisons because we don't want safety. We like the danger, especially if danger comes in young black flesh that I can get close to if I'm a police officer and arrest and incarcerate. The war on drugs. There's no war on drugs. If you're white and middle class, you can use drugs when you feel like it. You won't be arrested. There's prison abolition when it comes to whites who are middle class and higher. You can do what you want, and hey, I'm free, white, and 21. I won't go to jail for this. It's not going to happen. It doesn't happen. Statistically, we have proof of that. How much more proof do we need? Well, the pleasure of the system makes it impossible to argue with people in the direction of abolition. The prison industrial complex requires a war on drugs, but the prison industrial complex is itself required by something else, this perverse desire to see black flesh in chains. That's an old desire. It's older than the Republic, and it's just as hard to get rid of, especially when it creeps people out to even talk about it. Did it creep you out the way I talked about it? Did I slip into that cop zone too easily when I was talking about those young boys? Those young black boys that we like to arrest so much, that we like to see arrested, stop their development? Drug use and distribution behaviors do not vary according to race. They don't vary. People love drugs. It turns out they love drugs whether they're in a white skin, a black skin, and something in between, or whatever. They like drugs in this country. But you know what does vary? Enforcement varies. If you're black, you have a your chance of getting incarcerated in Albany is increased 58 times. Not 5 times like New York City, 58 times like Albany. In Albany, what they do is not police enforcement. It's great you're heading in a good direction, but it's racial profiling. That's what they do. That's how you get 58 to 1. There's no accident with 58 to 1. There's no nursing it away. There's no kumbaya getting together in the neighborhoods to get rid of 58 to 1. 58 to 1 means the crime is the policing. In Sanford, Florida, the crime is the policing. Yes, it's very sad that that young boy, like so many young boys who America doesn't care about, got killed by somebody who thought, let me get my rocks off now. What's available? That young black dude, he's available. Let me go kill him. That's an everyday decision in America. That's a crime. But the big crime is even when the whole world is watching, they can't get up off the corpse. Right, this is the scene that Americans debate now. There's an old dude, 28 isn't old, I'm super old now. How sad is that? I never thought this would happen. But who's 28? So do you go around looking for 17-year-old dudes? No, you don't. That's not normal to be in your car looking for 17-year-old dudes. Let me go, 17-year-old dude. I go get him. We don't need you to do that, sir. Oh, I'm going to go get him. I'm on it, right? And what's the scene that he's on? There he is, like hunched over the young boy's face-down body, grunting and slobbering or whatever it was on that twilight evening, right? There's a necrophiliac content to it, too, because the young boy's dead at the end of Zimmerman's satisfaction with him. But Zimmerman's isn't his and his alone. The people who defend this, right, are getting off in the same way. Catherine McKinnon, brilliant feminist, said, try arguing against pornography. Try arguing against the orgasmic power that those materials give the judge. You'll lose every time. right? People like their porn, people like their racial porn. The criminal justice system is our racial pornography. We're not worried about crime. You know what? Apply for a job as a black person, studies say, and then apply for a job as a white person with a felony conviction. Guess who gets the job? You know already. You knew before the study was done. You knew before I mentioned it. Who gets the job? White felon or black, identical resume, but for felony? No, I want to hear you say it. Call and response, just like, you know, I don't go to church, but if I went to church, there's call and response in church, right? Call and response? Can I get a yes, an amen? Say it? Amen. Fantastic, great, from the woman in the collar. Fantastic, thank you. So we do not, in fact, care about crime. We like to increase crime and implant it in young black bodies. That's why we arrest so many black people and put them in places that reproduce nothing but recidivism. We know it. So I was going to talk about fairy tales. And I had this line in my head driving up here today. Second star to the right, straight on till morning. I had a whole line about pixie dust and weird loves that dare not speak their name. But how to do that now? Do I have a minute? Do I? Okay, rock and roll then. Things are worse now than they were before. Let's not get caught up in the myth of progress. There's no such thing as a little bit racist. Frantz Fanon taught us that. A society, if it's going to have any little bit of racism, has to have it through and through, utterly and completely. But it also has to degrade you down to the level of what it's selling. It has to break you down so much, turn you out, so that you start talking about progress, as if the knife pulled out a little bit is progress. How many of these are we going to do? When I was 1 year old, James Baldwin said we were celebrating the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation 100 years too soon. Now what? We should do the same thing and say 150 years too soon? It's tiring. It's tiring to keep doing this. Remember Baldwin's letter to his nephew on the eve of the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation? He said to his nephew, a young boy, Trayvon's age, but not dead, they, meaning whites, are trapped in a history they don't understand. And until they understand it, they can't be released from it. They have to believe, they've had to believe for many years and for innumerable reasons that white people are superior. Many of them know better, but you know what? People find it difficult, and for a whole lot of reasons. We know that at Albany Law School, because it's not different. I could do more, but I already see a couple people getting nervous, so I won't do more just now. But I might, if you ask me. Many of them know better, but as you will discover, people find it difficult to act on what they know. To act is to be committed is to be in danger. In this case, the danger in the minds of many white Americans is the loss of identity. Try to imagine how you would feel if you woke up one morning to find the sun shining and all the stars aflame. You'd be frightened because it's out of the order of nature. This is Baldwin writing. Any upheaval in the universe is terrifying because it profoundly attacks one's sense of reality. And that's what's going on here when you can see a 28-year-old man cruising for young boys in the rain. When people can start saying that wearing a hooded sweatshirt. Is there anyone that does not own a hooded sweatshirt? When I was a child, there was something wrong with you if you didn't have a hooded sweatshirt. Yes, it's great to be in the band. Get yourself a hooded sweatshirt. I didn't say that with enough macho to be convincing at all, but you had to, that's why I had a hooded sweatshirt. Look, I'm really sporty. I have a hooded sweatshirt. Well, things are out of the order of, so this danger in the minds of white Americans is the loss of identity. It's frightening. It's out of the order of nature. Any upheaval in the universe is terrifying because it attacks that sense of reality. You feel crazy. Black president. Now I'm crazy. That can't happen. I feel crazy now. Well, the black man, Baldwin wrote, when I was one, has functioned in the white man's world as a fixed star, an immovable pillar. And as he moves out of his place, heaven and earth are shaken to their foundations. So if I'd taken a lot of time, I was going to do a cool thing about music and black people. Can I do a thing about music and black people? I got afraid because I realized upstate New York damaged me. It left me with, anyone heard me sing out here? I've got no song in my heart, no game, no coolness. It's really sad. So I was going to project all that out on white people instead of looking inward. Can I do it? Do I have your permission to do it? I'll quote Baldwin. Baldwin says, it's terrifying to listen to white people sing because they think a song is either happy or it's sad. And when they sing, you hear a shallowness that is terrifying in its inhumanity. Right? The song is either happy or it's sad. But black people know better. We know about a timeline, having suffered so long, that the same song can contain profound happiness as well as utterly devastating sadness. So a song like, I wish I could sing, Upstate New York. But My Lord, What a Morning. Does anyone know it? Anyone with a voice know it? How does it go? Can you help me out? You could. Go ahead, do it, please. This is what I dream of doing. Well, that's what I wanted. I wanted to go in this James Baldwin direction to talk about fixed pillars and stars falling out of the heavens and disturbing people's sense of reality in a profound way. There's no way to have a society that is only a little bit improved, a little bit not racist. The society is racist through and through. If it looks like things have improved, it's because they've succeeded in degrading you down to the level of the stuff they're handing you to eat. Baldwin understood that. He would have been equally disgusted to be talking about this 150 years after the Emancipation Proclamation declared us too soon to be free, declared falsely that we were free. The same thing happens now, but he discovered something about the white lack of reality and the black person's place in the universe, in the remade universe. He said it to his nephew. You, don't be afraid. I said it was intended that you should perish. It was intended you should perish. Perish by never being allowed to go behind the white man's definitions. Those would be the profiles. By never being allowed to spell your proper name. You have, and many of us have, defeated this intention, and by a terrible law, a terrible paradox, those innocents who believed that your imprisonment made them safe are losing their grasp of reality, right? The whole nation says it's innocent. Nobody says they're racist. Even George Bush said he wasn't racist. So who is? Nobody's racist, right? Zimmerman's not racist. He's Hispanic. Half. As though you can't, as though white over black isn't the absolute rule in every Spanish-speaking country in the world, as it is in every English-speaking country in the world. So, what do black people know? We're the only ones, Baldwin said, who know we didn't come to these shores willingly. Nobody came here willingly. Everybody who came here was beneath the gutter. Either some kind of criminal loser that was told to get to running. It's like NWA, right? 100 miles and running. That's what you were if you ended up here from elsewhere. But everyone else, the people who gave up their entire history to call themselves white, because nobody was white elsewhere. Whiteness begins here in the New World. When people give up whatever France had done to them, whatever Ireland had done to them, whatever Italy had done to them, whatever Germany had done to them, was surrendered in a heartbeat to be white. A made-up reality that required what? Blacks. But if you don't know how you've come to be in a place, that place is very scary to you. You got to start making up all kinds of crazy stuff, like that fixed pillar, that North Star, the black. And so they need to keep going to jail, right? Keep being really close to death to keep you happy and alive. Now, George Jackson. Raise your hand if you know who George Jackson is, who he was. Well, George Jackson, who wrote the most important book for any American to read, Soledad Brother, wrote in another book, Blood in My Eye, before he was killed. Anyone who can pass the civil service examination today can kill me tomorrow. Anyone who passed the civil service examination yesterday can kill me today with complete impunity. What we have in Sanford, Florida, is a new privatization of the right to kill black people. Now it's not just police officers who can do it with impunity, and they still can. If you're black and you're male, and you haven't had a police officer point his gun at your head, then you're in a minority of those of us who are black and male, or you're lying because you don't really want people to know that they pointed a gun at your head. Reach into your suit coat pocket, pull out your wallet, put it on the roof of your car. Right, that maneuver, the irony, I'm reaching into my suit to pull out my wallet while this guy has a gun pointed at my head. For what? So now you don't even need to pass the civil service exam, apparently, and people argue you don't even need to pass it. And that argument's important. The case is important, great. They arrest Zimmerman, that's great. Maybe some justice for Trayvon. But the whole department needs to be arrested. It's a department that couldn't shut itself off when the whole world was watching. It's a department that puts everybody in danger, no matter what happens to Zimmerman for what he did to Trayvon Martin. And if that goes uninvestigated, then it's a problem. So I'll pause there, because I've gone over my 10 minutes.
All right, at this point, we do have a reception waiting for us downstairs, but I think we can take maybe 1 or 2 questions at most, because I know we're really running up on time, so. And these questions can be addressed to the whole panel or one panelist.
Hi, my comment is for Sergeant Cox. Sergeant, okay. Assistant Chief, sorry.
I answer to anything.
But I just want to tell you this first. I come from the University of Albany. I'm a graduate student, master's program. And I want to say that because I'm in here now. And because I'm here, people will see that I'm somewhat educated. But out there, they don't know, right? So I just want to bring up, I don't want to criminalize anybody. I just want to bring up an incident that happened to me this past summer. Me and my 2 other friends who are black in master's program too. The police came following us down Central Ave. My friend's taillight was broken, basically. They waited till we turned on a dark street. They run up to us with their guns out. I'm not lying. The gun was like to my head. I was scared to move my cell phone, right? Asking us for our IDs. My friend had a snack wrap in his hand. What do you have, sir? What do you have? Pointing a gun at him. Now my question is, first of all, why did that have to happen? I told my friend what happened. They said, you shouldn't be out that late. Why, as a citizen of my own country, can I be out at 3 in the morning? We weren't doing anything, drinking anything. For a broken taillight, we put complaints at every level. This happened in August. They didn't get back to us till last month. This is the question I have for you. I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but see, you said in order to break the barriers in community, you have to know me by name, but you don't have to know me by name to treat me with respect. Because my friend is not even from here. They're not even from here. So we're college students just trying to get an education like anybody else. Because I'm a human being, you should respect me in the first place. You don't have to know my name. That's my only question. And I actually want to come out on a pedestal, just ask you, can you help me go further with, because they didn't get back to us, and they still haven't gotten back to us about, we put a complaint at all levels. We didn't like the way we were treated.
Absolutely. Please.
Okay.
I want to stick around. Let me talk to you afterwards.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you. Any others? I want to go to this side. I haven't gone to this side. Any questions? Okay.
Hi, my question is for the whole panel. Everyone here was talking about fear, and Mr. Jealous was also talking about fear. And I was wondering, how do we overcome fear when it's used by politicians for their own gain, when it's used by corporations to increase profit margins, when the people who are most impacted by that fear don't feel like they have a voice or a say or anything? So how do we overcome this institution of fear, whether it's the politicians or the corporations or the media who want ratings? How do we do it? And I know that's a hard question to answer and maybe an impossible question to answer, but I'd like to hear some possible solutions so we could maybe end on a hopeful note.
Well, I'm going to take it because I apologize. I have to leave. My students have their final exam and are trying a case in downtown Albany, and they've actually kept the courts open for us past 4:30. For those of you who know, they're closing them down. But I would say I disagree with Professor Farley in that there can't be any improvement. I don't think that when I was in law school, where my dean said, "Good morning, gentlemen," every time he came into my classroom, and there were essentially no people of color. There were very few women. I was in Arizona, so there were a few Hispanics and one Native American in my class. We would not have had a classroom that looked like this. We would not have had people who felt that they could confront an assistant chief and believe that perhaps there could be help, which I hope there is, as opposed to getting their head beaten in when they walked out the door. I don't think that there would be two professors of color who were on the panel. I don't think that President Jealous would be speaking. So I think that there is hope. I think that how you decrease fear. I mean, my son, who had a gun pointed at his head, did not believe that that happened because of race. He believed it happened because the guy probably wanted drugs and he just needed the money and he would have given it to him if he just asked him, which may or may not show you that my son is a little wacky, but the reality is that he's not afraid of people based on the color of their skin. The people in this room can learn to talk to one another, and I think that how you decrease fear is that you don't buy into the politicians, you don't buy into the corporations, you get to know one another's names, and you get to believe that you can judge one another on the basis of their character and not the color of their skin, how much money they make, or where they live. So thank you all very much for coming.
Any other panelists want to address that question before we break?
Yeah, I'll address it. So I didn't say there couldn't be progress. I said progress is far more than the nonsense that they feed us. Your presence in this room, my presence in this room, is not, in fact, a sign of progress. It's a reshuffling of the deck. Black people know that those of us who have access to a semblance of middle-class life are not, in fact, a middle class. Statistically speaking, we are a meaningless class. We are so few in number as to really not warrant more than a sentence or two in any book on black life. The vast majority of black people are born into a world accompanied by zero assets, like zero, actually nothing, no net financial assets. So there is something that we do for the system, though, being in these rooms. We make it look to, I mean, everyone who's white and middle class or upper class can have a black friend today. And that makes it look as though blacks have made progress, because those of us you meet are, by and large, pretty happy, right? If you're angry all the time, you tend to not stay in the middle class very long. Anyone want an angry black man? Vibrating with anger, right? Like, not with unironic anger. Nobody hires that. So you precipitate downward back to the ghetto, right, where you can wear your scowl free of possessions, too. So everybody white whose opinion counts gets to meet as many black people as they feel like meeting today, and that makes it look to white opinion leaders as though blacks have made progress. Part of the deal with the devil, really, for black people who are allowed to parade around in middle-class environments is to say, yes, we've arrived, things are better than before, we're moving forward, when in your heart, you know, we haven't arrived, we're not moving forward, even though many of us individually are, in fact, okay, right, or near to okay. But my being okay, your being okay, isn't America being okay. It's not our being okay. Even Obama's being okay, and I gave Obama all our money, and I'll do it again, happily. Go, Obama, go. Yes, we can. Yes, we can. So I'll do it. But even Obama doesn't mean a rival. The criminal justice system that the Panthers went to war against and were assassinated by the FBI over was 1/10 the size it has grown 10 times, tenfold since 1968. They're cities where most black people have felony convictions. They're cities where most young black people are in some active form of thraldom to the criminal justice system for stuff white people do. So that's not progress. For every little bit of progress, there's some other place that the virus or the cancer, that it metastasizes elsewhere. The hole is kept down, and people are kept singing the system's endless hymn of self-praise.